This is episode 2 of the pharmaphorum podcast. My name's Dominic Tyre and I'm pharmaphorum's creative director. For this episode, I went to Infirst Healthcare in London, where I met the up-and-coming consumer healthcare company's CEO, Manfred Scheske. A former European president at GSK Consumer Healthcare, Manfred talked about how he's seen the consumer health sector develop, what it's like for Infirst competing with Big Pharma, and innovation within the consumer sphere. You can find more details of this episode, including a download link for the podcast and information about other instalments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The podcast is also available on iTunes, where you can find and subscribe to it by searching for pharmaphorum. I'm here with Manfred Scheske, who's Chief Executive Officer of Infirst Healthcare in their London offices, for a chat about the direction of consumer health and the application of innovation to it. So, Manfred, welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I'm glad to have you here, Dominic.
So, great. So perhaps we could start off with just a little potted history of yourself. How do you find yourself sitting in London? How have you got to this stage?
Well, I think I can call myself rightly an industry veteran. Spent close to 40 years, I think, in over 30 years in large corporations, 25 of this in the pharmaceutical industry, specifically with GlaxoSmithKline and its legacy, SmithKline Beecham and Beecham. And when I left GlaxoSmithKline in 2010, I was still full of energy and didn't feel like I'm ready to retire. But nor did I feel like I should go back into another large corporation. I have kind of been there, done that, and been specifically looking for something more entrepreneurial. I met a team of people who were looking at drug development in a very different way, in a very interesting way, but also in a way which was leaning itself towards more primary care, consumer healthcare. And when I saw the products they were working on, I almost felt like it's a kind of innovation I would have wished somebody bring to me when I was running large businesses for GSK. So I joined them and started working with that team. Spent the first 2-3 years really on putting the structure in place, strategizing what I wanted to do. Was within a company was one staff, which was me, and 2.5, 3 years in, I completed the fundraising and properly set up Infirst Healthcare with what it is today. So that's how it started, and been 8 exciting years, and very happy with where we are today.
Okay, great. Well, we'll come on in due course to Infirst Healthcare and innovation within the consumer sector. But first, I'd like to draw on your experience. You mentioned that you were at GSK, and of course you were president of GSK's consumer health business across Europe. I think maybe spent 25 years in total at the company and its legacy companies. So from that vantage point, how have you seen the consumer health sector develop and change in the US and Europe over the last 5 or 10 years?
In a way, I'm quite disappointed with how the sector has developed and changed, because this should have been, the decades of this sector really steaming and growing and performing. Of course, the fundamentals are good. We have aging populations, and as we get older, we have more ailments and more symptoms, which is the home territory of consumer healthcare. But also governments have pushed more and more of their responsibility towards self-care. So all the fundamentals were right. And then you look at the growth of the industry, it's rather meager. It's actually trailing behind the prescription market growth, already only being a tenth of its size. And the question is, why is that? And what I would say is the sector has really focused on two big themes. One is M&A, or consolidation, and the other one is global marketing, trying to globalize the assets they have. So subsequently you've seen, big acquisitions. Subsequently, the multiples, the prices paid for the big targets going up all the time. And on the other side, we have seen, changes in global infrastructure and organization, more towards global marketing, with one set of instruments, brands, and go-to-market strategies being applied everywhere. Now that has worked to some extent for the big guys, but not across the board. Because if you look at how the sector has performed, they just said they're trailing behind RX, they're not growing the way they should grow. Of the top 10 in 2016, only the top 3 have shown growth, and most likely from consolidation rather than organic growth. And if you look at where's the biggest growth in the entire sector, then it's in the companies below the top 50, which have grown from, I think, something like 45% to 53% in importance in 2016. And I dare to say this is because of lack of innovation. Obviously, if you focus on global marketing, if you focus on M&A, you're not focusing on really developing new products or improving products. And I think this is quite evident if you look at these organizations, how much money do they spend, percent of sales on R&D? It's not much. And if you look at the risk they are taking, if you look at the money they spend on clinical studies, they're not doing many. So it is rather meager, and I think opportunities are being missed here. It's very obviously attractive to go for next big acquisition. It gives you different scale, different league, and you can take cost out. But it's not driving the industry and not driving the sector.
And certainly as a journalist covering the pharmaceutical industry for nearly 20 years now, you can certainly see that those waves of mega mergers, as the journalist shorthand tends to be occurring. A little bit fewer, I suppose, nowadays. That there aren't that many more companies, one would assume, that can still merge. But we'll see. We've seen in the pharma space Takeda snapping up Shire just yet. So there's still no end to the big mergers within big pharma.
I think in consumer we have seen a bit of a shift. As I said, the prices for the targets have gone up, almost every year. But then we've also seen a shift more from acquisition to mergers. We've seen Scheske and Novartis merging their consumer businesses. We've seen Boehringer and Sanofi merging or swapping businesses. So that's been a bit more of a trend. But that goes also along with the trend of obviously the prices having reached the ceiling. And obviously everybody will have seen that Pfizer has tried or is still trying to divest their consumer business and has failed to attract bidders. Or 2 bidders left who have then dropped out. We don't know what's going to happen next, but there appears to be, at least a temporary ceiling being reached there.
So within that then you've got so much attention focused on M&A and mergers and just the business of doing business perhaps. What does that mean for innovation, or what has that meant for innovation within consumer healthcare? I suppose one tends to think of the consumer space as not quite as nimble, perhaps not quite as innovative as clearly as biotech or maybe traditional pharmaceuticals, but within consumer then, how has innovation been affected?
Well, fundamentally, the consumer healthcare sector is generic in nature. You wouldn't find a new molecule you're going straight into consumer. Very, very, very rarely that is the case. I know of 1 or 2 cases, but that is the absolute exception. So typically it's generic. These are products already proven to be safe and effective within the remit of the prescription market, and then eventually becomes switches and made available directly to consumers. So not surprisingly, a switch has been a centerpiece of the innovation strategy of that sector for decades. More so in the US than in Europe, by the way, to a very, very different scale. But switches are drying out. All the easy switches have happened, and there are not many, not many coming behind. And in order to go for the next big switches, that will require a completely different set of risk-benefit assessment from regulators, as well as pharmacovigilance requirements. So that won't be easy. Then if you look at the wider scale of what are the tools and the strategies being used in consumer, it all centers around on trying to lower the regulatory risk as much as we can, lower the cost, and find ways to address pathways in a different way. So you will find a lot of borderline products, borderline medicines, cosmetics, borderline medicines, food, dietary supplements, lower regulatory hurdles, easier to do. You will find even medical devices widely used, products which you wouldn't think are medical devices, but these may be products, even ingested products, which do not act systemically and are being launched as medical devices, with lower regulatory requirements. It all boils down to lowest possible risk, maximum chance of success, and how can I get the best claims out of it, to the extent that sometimes the claims are more important than the actual efficacy of the product.
Okay, so within this environment then, what's the role of Infirst healthcare? Where do you fit into to the sector, would you say?
First of all, if you look at our website, at what we do and what we say, we call it known drugs made better. I think the essence is that we fundamentally believe that known drugs and known molecules can be improved. I like to say that if the pharmaceutical industry would have developed the iPhone, we would still have the iPhone 1, because somehow continuous improvement is not what we do. You can go to any other industry and they continuously improve their product. When iPhone brings out a new iPhone, you can be sure that they're already working on the next, if not the next 2 generations, to follow up on this. And that's just not the case in the pharmaceutical industry. Once we have a product approved and ideally patent protected, it is good to go until it expires, and then it can go generic. So we are not really applying continuous improvement techniques and strategies. This is where we come in. Known drugs made better. So we're not reinventing wheels. We're not looking for new molecules. We're looking for substances already known to be safe and effective, trying to improve them by making them either more efficacious or safer, or ideally both.
And within that then, exactly, specifically, what sort of drugs are you looking to make better, and what sort of things can you do to take these known drugs and make them better?
Our key asset is ibuprofen, which we have worked on for the last 8 years. We have a few other molecules we are working on and we are looking at, but ibuprofen is probably the best example. Ibuprofen has been around since the 60s, and one of the most widely used drugs in the world, probably. If I look forward at the need for NSAIDs, if anything, it's going to increase, because more and more age-related symptoms and conditions associated with inflammation, so inflammatory control is an increasing need. So that's why we were attracted to NSAIDs and to ibuprofen in particular. But also, as we see it is used more and more widely, that more and more side effects come to the surface. So we've always known that NSAIDs, ibuprofen, are GI erosive, and that some patients suffer from either mild or all the way up to very severe GI side effects. We have recently, in the recent years, learned the cardiovascular risk which go along with ibuprofen, including stroke and heart attacks. We are aware of, very rarely so, the risk of chronic kidney diseases to go along with NSAIDs. And all these side effects are dose and duration related. So looking at the formulation of ibuprofen or the presentation of ibuprofen and find a way where we can present it in a dose sparing way, in other words, keep the efficacy but lower the dose, we thought that's a very attractive thing to do, and that's what we focus on. Specifically, what we have done is we formulate ibuprofen in lipids, and which brings a number of benefits. And we have a few immunologists in our team or in the starting team who know a lot about immunology and how to target immune cells or attract immune cells, to be more precise. Lipids are well-known adjuvants in vaccine technology, but are not used much with classical drug development, other than improving absorption. So this is what we focus on initially. A lot of laboratory work to experiment with various compounds and with lipids. They've been put through a whole series of preclinical assays in which we have been able to demonstrate superior efficacy in pulmonary inflammation models, in gastrointestinal inflammation models, in rheumatoid arthritis inflammation models, in gastroerosion models, and that gave us the confidence to go into full-blown development of this improved ibuprofen.
Quite a gutsy move to look at the work you're doing to innovate known drugs, but then you've also been running clinical trials to actually back up what the work you've been doing, which is quite an unusual move within the consumer healthcare space.
Correct, yeah. I mean, coming out of the preclinical development, that gave us the confidence really to do two things. First of all, a full-blown drug development of a quasi-generic drug, but also secondly, clinical development and clinical proof of the efficacy of what we wanted to demonstrate. And if I may go to the clinical side, yes, we've put the product into a large phase 3 study. Probably one of the largest studies of ibuprofen for decades, and certainly, as far as I know, the only study, the first and only study in the specific patient population with flaring joint pain or flaring knee pain. That's what we have done, and in that study we were able to demonstrate that what I call dose sparing earlier, that our formulation, ibuprofen formulated or dissolved in lipids, is as effective as at an OTC dose, as effective as a prescription dose to reduce pain and inflammation. And that was very obviously exciting. Also, as on top of this, we have seen in that very study, which was a 3-arm large study, over 460 patients in there, across UK and the Netherlands. We've also seen that the AEs, the adverse events, specifically the GI events, were significantly lower in our group than in the prescription dose group.
When it comes to the sales and marketing push behind the product, and you'll be looking to reach both patients and healthcare professionals, or both patients, or just patients with the product?
At this stage, we have obtained a license in the UK, and if I may, shift a little bit, I don't want to underestimate that the the leap, we had to take the leap of faith to develop the drug. We spent, over 8 years, we spent over 20 million pounds on that development, and even, within larger companies' budget, that's a big effort. Apart from the clinical study, quite a bit was also, went into manufacturing development, turning this into, a proper product with a manufacturing dossier, with including the whole sequence of analytical requirements which needed to be developed and validated was a huge task. Mm-hmm. And so subsequently, yes, we have we've been through the regulatory path in the UK initially. We have Flarin is approved with a P license, pharmacy only license right now. Having said this, we have prescription and as well as GSL licenses in process, and so we don't want to stop here. Right now, the product's being marketed to consumers directly as a P product, which is available behind the counter to the pharmacist, but on our pathway forward, we want to go downstream as well as upstream. And this just goes with the utility which comes with NSAIDs. NSAIDs is one of these drugs which has that wide utility. You find it in hospital, you find it at the surgery level, you find it in at prescription behind the counter level, and you find it all the way to grocery stores and on the shelf and convenience stores. So this is how wide the utility is, and so we're starting here, but we think we can go much wider.
In terms of going wider, not just with Flarin, this particular product, but your portfolio as a whole, where would the next directions, do you think, be for Infirst Healthcare? I'm sure you're concentrating right now on this first product, but looking to the future, where would you like to see more innovation within consumer healthcare that you think you'd be able to provide?
That's a very good question, Dominic, and I'd like to say I don't quite know yet, but let me explain why I say that, because we have a very exciting development in our portfolio, which is treatment for cough. Cough is not well looked after. It's one of these areas where numerous Cochrane reports have stated there is no evidence that any of the cough medicine works, nor is evidence that they don't work. But there's also no European-wide or globally, good understanding of what should be used for cough. Most of the products being used are of narcotic and opioid nature, either codeine or dextromethorphan. We have an asset in our portfolio which is non-narcotic, non-opioid, has shown good efficacy, and which we could bring forward on a truncated clinical and regulatory pathway, and for which we already have EMA approval for a centralized procedure eligibility. Having said this, it still requires a clinical and regulatory program. At the same time, if we look at what we see almost every day coming up with Flarin, is super exciting. It's like you're climbing a hill and you see new land, and that's what we see. The opportunities with Flarin are enormous. We gain even ever more confidence that this is a way NSAIDs in general should be formulated, and it is just fascinating, how that lipid formulation drives. I wouldn't say efficacy, but it's more efficiency. So we achieve more with a lower dose, while at the same time, lowering, improving GI tolerability. So it's a tough question with the scarce resources we have as a small, privately funded company. Are we pushing this further first, or are we going for the next opportunity? It's a nice problem to have, and I don't have. Sure. We're working on the answers, but I don't have the answer yet.
Oh no, that's fair enough. I can imagine it's quite a tricky balancing act at the moment. So, you mentioned, of course, that Infirst Healthcare is a relatively small company. I think at the moment it must be quite different from your days at GSK, sitting in GSK House in Brentford. So, I mean, looking to not necessarily compare those two specific companies, but as a small company, what's it like competing with the bigger players? What are you able to do? What are you not able to do?
Well, I think this applies to any industry. I mean, as you said, I've spent 25 years with Scheske in continental Europe, in the US, in London, in the UK. And I pretty much know how it works. I know the industry. I've served on the big industry board in the US and in Europe. I'm still a member of the board of the PHEB today. But when you're in a small company and in an entrepreneurial environment, it is quite obvious that you have to do things differently. With limited resources compared to the big players with unlimited resources, large infrastructures, we cannot win by doing the same, by thinking the same way, by following the same templates. We have to go really, where the big players don't go, and we have to go, there in ways where size doesn't matter, but where we, find creative ways to challenge the status quo, but also, deliberately, take risk which a big player wouldn't want to take, and including the risk to fail.
Well, Manfred, we've begun this podcast interview looking at where the consumer health sector has developed over the last 5 to 10 years. If I could ask you to get your metaphorical crystal ball out and look in a little bit into the future. Clearly, if we look at the pharmaceutical industry, there's an obvious shift to specialty care. One only has to look at the top-selling pharmaceutical products to see the big hitters there in oncology and immunology dominating the charts. And with that has come a shift away from primary care. So with that as some of the background, where would you see consumer healthcare going over the next 5 to 10 years, do you think?
I think we will see a range of options, and we see momentum and change, at various ends. On the one side, we see a few consumer players clearly going more towards an FMCG approach to consumer care, or consumer healthcare, and that would include, companies like Reckitt Benckiser, who have come out of, FMCG. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with Procter & Gamble. They seem to come back into consumer healthcare. There was a time when we thought they're going out, partnering with Teva. Now that partnership seems to go, somewhere else. They've acquired the eMerck consumer business. So there seems to be a new ambition, but they are clearly FMCG players. I would say GSK was a huge and hugely successful oral care portfolio, but then OTC at the same time. I would put them more as although they have big GSK behind them, but I think they are more an FMCG player. So which obviously would drag the consumer healthcare business away from primary care, rather towards it. At the same time, I think we will find more smaller, mid-sized regional players who are really utilizing combined strengths in primary care and OTC. And if we look across the global or even the European landscape, we will find that the markets work very differently in every territory. We in a global company, we want it all to be the same, but it isn't. In order to be successful globally, you have to accept asymmetry. And if I want to buy an ibuprofen in UK, I can get it in a corner shop. If I want to do it in Germany, I have to go into a pharmacy, and it's behind the counter. And if I get it in France, I probably fully expect it to be paid by the government and be on prescription. But that's a world that we live in. So I can see that some companies will also do very well by combining primary care with OTC. And being flexible to play in either of these areas, not in specialty care, but also not in hard selling FMCG, but in a more ethical kind of definition of primary care, or the way I like to call it is first-line intervention. So I think there is no one template which will evolve. There will be various pictures of consumer healthcare with a lot of borderline developments at the periphery towards food, towards cosmetics, and towards dermatology and skincare and so forth.
And it'll certainly be fascinating, I think, looking at how that develops. But looks like we've come to the end of the time for our interview for this part of the podcast. So, Manfred, thank you very much for joining me for the interview.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Dominic.
And that's it for this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Infirst Healthcare's Manfred Scheske on consumer healthcare and innovation. You can find more details of this episode, including a download link for the podcast and information about other episodes in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The podcast is also available on iTunes, where you can find and subscribe to it by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website to sign up for daily or weekly email pharmaceutical news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, where we are at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.